What's your craziest it's a small world moment? I am from a small town in the west of Ireland. I was on a bus in Nicaragua when I heard someone saying the name of my town. I turned around and started talking to the guy. Turns out we were from the same housing estate. My wife's best friend went to Madrid once, got trashed and hooked up with a guy. They never exchanged any details. Just heat of the moment kind of thing. She ran into him in San Francisco in her own building. Apparently he had lived there for about a year at that point and neither of them could recall running into each other before. They're now married. This seems to happen all the time to me. I was visiting London on my way to India. Met up with a girl I had met previously in Haiti. She was hanging out with a friend of hers and a guy from Canada. The four of us went to dinner together and the two girls showed us around London. A year later, I ran into that same guy in a conference in Denver, Colorado. We had the weirdest "don't I know you from somewhere" interaction until we realized where we had previously met. I moved to New Zealand a few years ago. One of the guys I was flatting with asked me what state I was from. I said North Carolina. He said, "Oh, I know some people from North Carolina." I just laughed because NC has a lot of people. Turns out not only did I know the couple, I had been there when they got engaged, at a beach party in Virginia we were all at. I visited South Africa in 2013. Some friends of mine who had moved from there to the US got me in touch with someone they knew who had just moved from Cape Town to Johannesburg. He kindly let me stay with him in his new place there. After a few days, I decided Joburg was a bit dodgy and decided to fly over to Cape Town. He introduced me to a guy who introduced me to a guy, and somewhere in that chain I found someone to stay with. He sent me a text a few days later asking me how I was enjoying Cape Town. I told him it was great. He asked me where I was staying and I told him that I was in Van Riebeekshof. That piqued his interest and he asked me for the address. Turns out I was staying in his old house that he had just moved out of a few months ago. Also, while in South Africa, I met this guy who told me he was dating some chick from the US long distance. She was in Chicago, where I'd never been. So I was just like, whatever. A few months after coming back to the US, I met this girl and was telling her about my trip. But she said, "Oh, a friend of mine is dating a guy in South Africa. She lives in Chicago now but I still keep in touch with her." It was the same girl. I'm convinced there's only really like 500 people in the world and the rest are just cardboard cutouts or something. My mom and her boyfriend went to Vegas, we are from the Netherlands, and saw David Copperfield in the MGM. Guess who got the tickets sitting next to them? Their neighbors. In my first job out of college in Boston in 2011, I had a co-worker, let's call him Bob. We only worked together for 9 months and then he left the company. I left shortly thereafter. In February 2017, I accepted a new position at a company in Los Angeles and relocated. That April, Bob accepted a position at the same company, on my team, and also moved across the country. The odds of this felt so small, but it was cool to see a friendly face in a totally new city. I married someone from the other side of the county, USA. Turns out our ancestors were from the same small town in Poland. Roll Tide. Despite being from thousands of miles away, the same person is 1. My college roommate's high school girlfriend. 2. My high school friend's wife's college roommate. 3. One of 5 people in my oldest friend's graduate school program. 4. The person who annoys me most in the world. I keep running into this person in totally unrelated contexts. I was on a tour in St. Petersburg, Russia. I started talking to another completely random couple on the bus. Turns out, they were from the same small town in Indiana that I'm from and they even knew most of my extended family. Everyone is from Indiana. I met someone as a kid. I was about 4, in a post office in Jersey, the country, not the state. My mum and his parents got on well and ended up going to the pub and just doing things during the day. After the holiday I went back to Australia and we didn't really keep in contact. Skip forward to when I was 16. Met this guy online who lived in Jersey, got talking and ended up becoming pretty good friends. He mentioned about he remembers meeting an Aussie kid when he was young and hanging out for the day with his parents at a post office. Turns out that was the same family and kid. Crazy small world. Till there's a country named Jersey. I had a really cool teacher 3rd grade and part of 4th. She quit teaching in the States to travel and teach around the world. She came back for a visit 6th grade and told me I'll see you in the world someday. Years and years later I'm in Malaysia helping to open a call center. Our local colleges were showing us around Petling Street, Haggler's Market, and in a movie-like crowd parting moment my teacher was walking through the crowd. We grabbed a pot of tea from one of the stalls. My co-workers got to hear some stories about me when I was a kid and then she went back off into her adventures. Was working a crappy job that often threatened me with being fired if I didn't work off the clock on some days. Was walking back home in the pitch black. No sidewalks because the city was too cheap to actually clear the snow off them. Worried about getting hit by a car, but also wishing it would happen a little bit. Guy in a massive truck pulls alongside me, asks me if I need a ride. Climb and tell him where I live. At that time with an uncle because my job was too far for me to commute from my actual residence. Get there and my grandmother, who also lived with my uncle for health reasons, sees the guy in the truck and yells at him. They talked, laughed, joked, and the guy shook my hand and told me to be on my best behavior or he would kill me. Turned out the guy was my grandmother's high school sweetheart, and he a former Iron Horseman, as in from the biker gang. Club. They're called clubs, unless you want one or all of them to frick you up. I was playing Black Ops 1 on my Xbox the other day. There were a few thousand people online worldwide playing. I came up against a party of 3 who were causing me a real headache and making it a proper challenge. Out of interest, I checked their gamer profile. All 3 were from the same little town in southern England as myself with a population of about 10,000 people. I didn't know anyone still played Blops. I hung out with the same group of friends throughout high school. It was only halfway through my senior year that my one friend showed me a picture of her grandma. Her grandma and my grandma were really close. I would go to her grandma's house sometimes. I don't even know how we managed to go 4 years before finding that out. My fiancee's 2 grandmas knew each other well before her parents, their son and daughter, respectively, got married. They both lived in the same general area but different cities. I met someone in college that I became good friends with because she was living on the floor above me in the dorms. About 4 months after meeting and being friends she tells me where she's from, and it's where some of my extended family is from. I asked if she knew where one house was that my great uncle and his family used to live in, and it turns out that she actually lives in their old house now. I was so blown away because we go to a very large college, and it is a pretty small town she lives in. What are the odds? I'm from Winnipeg, Canada. I ran into a girl from back home while I was walking through a bar in Surfers Paradise, Australia, almost 14,000 kilometers away. I lived in Winnipeg for a while, grew up in Carmen. I was taking some Chinese classes in Taiwan. First day of class, the guy sitting next to me introduces himself. Turns out we had the same first name, were both from Winnipeg and he lived about 4 blocks from where I lived. I was flying from Taiwan to Canada. I had a layover in Japan and while waiting to board the plane, I start talking to the older couple in front of me. They tell me they are from Gretna, Manitoba, tiny town. He is a school teacher there. I mentioned that my grandfather used to be a teacher there and also that my cousin, who had been staying with me in Taiwan, had made a friend in Taiwan who grew up in Gretna. After telling him her name, he said that he had been her teacher. I then told him where I grew up and he asked me if I knew a certain boy. I told him that I'd gone to school with him from K-12. The guy then said he was his uncle. Too far. I like it. Ride broke down at Disney World. We're sitting in the boat for a while, right beside the bird who has a head that spins around in a circle endlessly. I guess that made a dude in our boat go squirrely. He starts yelling first, really loud. There are announcements to stay in the boats and wait for it to resume. He may not have understood, or maybe he didn't care, but after being animated and yelling at the people he was sitting with for a few minutes he finally gets up and jumps out of the boat and starts running through the water. It was half hilarious and half crazy. They were yelling at him over the speaker. Sure enough he goes out of sight. Everyone else is yelling at each other in the front of the boat. I thought one of them was going to jump out too, but none of them did. Anyway, I'm sure it would have been only a few minutes delay, but thanks to that dude we were sitting for another half hour before it resumed. And when we got off the ride, operators led his family off in some weird direction. Probably to bail him out of Donald Duck jail. Yeah, but what's that got to do with? 1. I'm from Canada. I was on a business trip in Bangkok and practically flying through a mall to make a meeting I was already late for when I hear someone call my name, which is unique enough that it stops me in my tracks. I turn around and it's my cousin. Yep, I ran into my cousin halfway around the world when neither of us had a clue the other was even in the country, when we hadn't seen each other in person in years, in a mall in Bangkok. In the literally 2 seconds I would have been in his line of sight as I raced by. Such a ridiculous coincidence. 2. On my first trip to Mexico, I ended up falling in love with the lime pie at a particular restaurant, so I bet I ate it 4+ times in the week I was there. This was of great amusement to the waiter, who finally gave me the recipe after significant negotiation. Later that summer, after a season of tree planting in the interior of British Columbia, my friend and I decided to stop at a newly opened Mexican restaurant in Penticton. Much to my delight, there was lime pie on the menu, and to my greater delight, the same dang waiter from Mexico. It was a very comical OMG you moment when we spotted each other, and the recognition was immediate. TLDR. 1. Ran into my Canadian cousin in a mall in Thailand. 2. Ran into a Mexican waiter with an excellent lime pie recipe in a small town in Canada. LOL about the Mexican pie. I thought it was going to be some euphemism for I got a girl or something like that. When I was playing RuneScape back when I was a kid in middle school, I befriended someone while speaking and we ended up being close friends in the game and playing frequently together as we progressed. Turned out that he was actually my first cousin from my mother's side. My mother's family lives in Wisconsin and we live in California. I never met any of my mother's side of the family until I was in high school. I met someone on an app online. They lived about 2.5 hours away from me and we never met. Just friends on Snapchat that talked a lot. I lived in DC at the time and flew out to California for a competition. While there she tells me her friend from her school is at the same competition. I go and meet her friend and it was strange to think somehow we both ended up here across the country. 2 of my friends were talking at the bar. They had just met and they didn't know that they both knew me. They happened to both tell a story that involved myself. At this moment I had just walked into their conversation. At that moment they realized they were both unknowingly telling a story about me. Now you've got to tell the stories. I ran into a childhood friend on the Peter Pan ride at Disney World I hadn't seen in 10 years. Peter Pan is the ride right next to the It's a Small World ride. Double whammy. So one day I'm training at Rock Crabs back in LIGO 4 in RuneScape and I meet this kid who was also making a Gmall Pure. As was I. We add each other to friend lists and all that and we talked a bit more over the next few days. Fast forward about a week. And little 8-9-year-old Luke is doing what he usually did on the weekend, scaping while talking to my good buddy Cam on the telephone, before Skype TeamSpeak, so he goes, hey, my cousin is over, he plays too, you should add him. So of course I go to add him and I get that player is already of your friends list. He was the guy I met a week or 2 prior training my character. We are all still friends to this day and hang out in real life every few days and every now and then this story still comes up. At any point there was 250k plus players back in the golden days of RuneScape. I can't believe how small that world was. What an awesome story. I have a similar one from RuneScape. I used to be in this one clan and just before I left, a guy from the same town I used to live in joined said clan. He ends up living about 15 minutes away from my house. Ended up meeting him, and now we're always talking. He's someone very special to me. My brother recently moved to West Palm Beach. One day my parents and I were up there taking his son out to dinner while my brother and sister-in-law were at the hospital popping out another heir to the throne. We went to a restaurant across from their house. A Cuban place with great food and a lovely pianist filling the restaurant with gorgeous melodies from the island my parents and grandparents fled. As we were finishing, my mom walked over to the lady and started to express her love and gratitude for bringing them music from home. The lady asked my mom when she came from Cuba, so my mom started to tell her story and worked in how her piano playing really reminded her of my dad's mother. My dad's mom was a pianist and opera singer in Cuba. They talked about where my dad was born, etc. The lady all of a sudden, clear as a whistle, started to pinpoint the neighborhood, the house, the street, and then my grandmother's name. My mom started to cry. The lady had known my grandmother since she was little. My dad came over and the lady started to explain that she pretty much knew my dad's entire family from Cuba and how she was so happy to hear that they made it out and safe. The lady had spent time with my grandmother and knew her pretty well. My dad told her that his mom had already passed, and you could tell the lady was just content knowing that my grandmother fled and lived a long life like she was doing at that moment. It was such a small world at that moment for us. Years and years had passed and someone still remember my grandmother signing in Cuba. Someone that knew her personally. It was kind of beautiful. Traveled 1,800 kms, 1,100 miles, from Ottawa to St. John's. That's the equivalent to driving from London to Belarus, only to run into the Ottawa Senators, my city's NHL team, in the first bar I walk into. To top it off, I go to order a drink and happen to sit beside a couple who start to chat me up. Lady, hey, isn't it cool that the Ottawa Senators are here? We're from Ottawa. It's so weird to see them here. Me. I had this one elementary school teacher who I absolutely loved. The guy put on a full Star Wars marathon for the last week of classes because we both loved the franchise. When I graduated, I got him a replica of Aragorn's sword, Andoril, which now hangs in his living room. I only visited him twice while I was in high school because the distance was a bit much. However, since I was very close with my high school teachers, I visited my high school multiple times after graduating. This past year I went to visit my high school again and found out that my favorite elementary school teacher had started working there. Visiting there now is like a one-stop wholesome nostalgia worth about 6 years of my life. It's great. Well, that's awesome. I'm originally from Georgia, same as my parents, and a few years ago I was working at a hotel in Sheridan, Wyoming, 2 hours away from the nearest major city. It was about 10 o'clock that evening and I was on the last hour of my shift when this guy towing a massive boat comes down the driveway. He's moving up to Alaska and was moving his stuff up to Seattle to basically just sail the rest of the way to the great frontier. We haggle the prices a bit, and since my goal is to get people in rooms and we had some vacancies left, I lowered his price a few bucks and bullshitted about the world. He mentions he's a lawyer, and I mention my dad was a lawyer. He still is, but he was back then, too. Guy asks where my dad practiced. I tell him he's barred in Georgia. Bit more back and forth, and it turns out, he knew my dad when they practiced law in North Georgia. Not together, but they flew in the same social circles. To recap, this guy knew my dad from Georgia and happened to stop in Sheridan at the hotel I was desking at while he was moving to Alaska. Experience was so unexpected I can still remember the guy's name. Completely by chance, I ended up attending boarding school on the other side of the country with a guy who I went to kindergarten with a decade before that. Same. I was assigned to a flat in university with a girl I AHD gone to both primary and secondary school with. Fun times. Getting on the subway and sitting down next to a friend of a friend I hadn't seen in a while. Not like seeing her and going, oh, hey, just completely obliviously sitting next to her until she tapped me on the shoulder. I went to Rome for the first time between Christmas and New Year's, just for a few days before moving on to Florence. I was stood with my fiance at the side of a street while he took a phone call. Whilst waiting I was staring into space and subconsciously thought something seemed familiar, and then suddenly I realized I was looking directly at my ex-boyfriend stood on the opposite side of the road eating a sandwich. We had been together 5 years, broken up 2 years prior to this and hadn't spoken to each other at all in that time as it ended on bad terms, and he was in a different country that neither of us had visited before. Needless to say, I got my fiance walking away with me very quickly before my ex realized I was there. Been working at a law office for a while now. Got this one attorney that keeps suing a few of our clients over and over again. Found out this weekend that he's suing my dad now. I am in a parking garage. turning a corner and a bit spaced out, and there was a backup of some sort, and I rear-end a guy. Nothing too bad. A bit of a dent in the other bumper of an older car, but damage nonetheless, and we trade information. I never hear from the guy, which was much appreciated since I was just out of college, and while working full-time, this would have been a major dent in my meager savings. Fast forward about 6 months. It's summer. I am in Lower Manhattan, just off the train and looking for a bar to meet my friends at. This is just before smartphones, and the financial district is a labyrinth. I am having a hard time finding the small side street this place is on. Then the skies open up in a thunderstorm. Pouring rain. I take refuge in a building entrance alcove and tried to text Google for directions. That was a thing for a period of time, but it's not working. Exasperated, I see a guy walking out the door in a hurry and ask if he knows where this bar is. He says yeah, it's just around this corner, and make a left, and hurries off. The encounter was over in 3 seconds, and I pretty much ran in that direction due to the rain and now being late. But halfway down the block I realized the guy that gave me directions was the guy I hit in the parking garage. Thanks, parking garage guy, you really helped out a young guy twice when he needed it. Bro, that's your guardian angel. Bumped into my best mate and his family while on holiday at Disneyland, while they were also on holiday, as we were about to queue for the titular ride. Just a little spooky. I'm from near Glasgow, Scotland. I met a guy from high school in a dive bar in Waterloo, Iowa. Not exactly tourist central. Turns out, after uni he got a job out there. I was visiting my then GF. Very confusing minute or two while we worked out the reasons. My best small world moment is that there's someone else in Iowa in this thread. I made friends with some guy at school in a relatively small town in the UK. We later found out my grandma and his granddad were also friends from when they met on one of the Channel Islands where they both went on holiday every year. We'd been pretty good friends for a couple of years before we found out. When I was working in Switzerland and took the weekend off to go to Paris, I was talking to a high school friend a day before I left, and we both didn't mention anything about Paris or France. He sent me a picture of Paris randomly as I was on the TGV, on my way to Paris. Now, you have to realize we both went to an international school in another part of the world, then on to universities in 2 different countries, both of which aren't in Europe. So off chance that I message him a day before and he sends me a picture that he was in Paris too. We were there at the same time. The last time I saw him in person was 3 years ago. Before that time, it's super ridiculous how we ran into each other. Met a girl while on vacation in France. She was a local. We chatted some, hung out for a day and said goodbye. Didn't exchange contact details. About 6 months later I was at a conference in Rome, Italy, and I bumped into her at a bar in the evening. She was also attending. We both couldn't believe the coincidence, so we banged that night like crazy. Also the next day, and the next. We didn't exchange contact details but told each other that if we ever meet again, we should totally bang again. A friend and I were in Interlaken, Switzerland, and were talking to a guy who started talking about his hometown in the US, which happened to be my hometown. He happened to be the little brother of an old school friend I hadn't seen in years. He was an even bigger butt than his brother, but still a pretty crazy coincidence. Everywhere we go we meet someone my wife knows. Disneyland, SeaWorld, Bermuda, Arizona, everywhere. We moved to a new town. Someone she knew moved in 2 doors down. The brother of her best friend from high school moved in across from us. I went to college 300 miles away from my small hometown. I came down with a cold and went to a local doctor. While he was looking me over he asked where I was from. I told him some dinky little town in northern Indiana he's probably never heard of. He told me his grandfather's best friend was from a town like that, then said the name. It was my hometown. His grandfather's best friend was my grandfather. They met in the Navy during World War II. I swear I can't go anywhere where there's not someone that knows my family. Walking down the Champs-Élysées in Paris, my dad sees someone wearing a Canada baseball cap. Being the gregarious man he is, he introduces himself and asks where in Canada the man is from. The man isn't from Canada, but his wife is, from the same area my mom grew up. Dad pulls mom and my grandfather over. and we all find out that this woman is a second cousin to my mom who she'd never met. Was hanging out at a friend's house back in like 2010 when I lived in Washington state. His friend, who I just met for the first time, needed a ride home, so I offered. During the drive, we come to find out we had both worked at the same grocery store in Wisconsin in 2007, except he worked days and I worked graveyard stocking shelves. At some point during shift change in the morning, we had probably passed each other on a few occasions. In high school I was sort of friends with a guy in our OTC. He was a year above me. He graduates and goes and does whatever. I graduated the following year and I joined the Navy. I go to nuke school in Charleston, and when I'm in power school I bump into him. He's in the first part, A school. Huh, that's cool. A few months later I'm on leave and back home, and randomly bump into him at a gas station at night, way out in the middle of nowhere. Fast forward a few more months. I'm on my submarine and stationed in Groton, CT, and we had just gotten back from an underway, spending a month at sea, and on the way back to my barracks room I get this sudden urge to pop into the bar on base, and damned if the same mother is just sitting there like he was waiting for me. Maybe coincidence, maybe stalker? Maybe not the craziest, but this happened last night. New neighbors move in next door last April. Aside from waving, etc. Hadn't really met them, not surprising, it's a weird neighborhood. So we have some really big weeds growing on a shared fence, and I hadn't gotten to them in a while. So I go into his yard and start weed whacking on his side of the fence. Soon neighbor comes out with pruners and begins helping. He and the wife get talking, turns out they grew up in the same town, went the same high school 1 year apart, tons of mutual friends, and his sister and my wife were actually close growing up as little kids. Also turns out he's really laid back, rare for our neighborhood. Small but world. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.